The German shepherd's snarl echoed through the empty shelter as another volunteer backed away, rubbing their bitten hand. "That dog's a lost cause," the manager sighed, slamming the kennel door shut. "Nobody can touch him, not even the trainers." The 110-pound beast paced like a caged tiger, teeth bared at every shadow. His file read, "Max, aggressive, do not approach." But in the corner of the room, a tiny figure stood still, watching. 6-year-old Lily tilted her head. "Why's he so angry, Daddy?" Her father pulled her back. "Because some dogs forget how to trust, sweetheart." Lily's eyes stayed locked on Max, and in that moment, nobody noticed the German shepherd had stopped growling. The shelter fell silent as Max, the ferocious German shepherd, locked eyes with the little girl. His chest still heaved from the aggressive barking, but something about Lily's calm stare made his ears twitch. The staff held their breath. This was the dog that had sent 2 experienced handlers to the hospital. One wrong move, and those powerful jaws could snap. But Lily didn't flinch. She took a tiny step forward, her pink sneakers squeaking on the concrete floor. Her father lunged to grab her, but the shelter manager held up a hand. "Wait," he whispered. "Look at the dog." Max's lips lowered over his teeth. His tail, usually stiff with tension, gave the faintest wag. It was so small you'd miss it if you blinked. Lily giggled. "He's not scary," she announced, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. The adults exchanged glances. Was this a trick? A moment of false calm before another attack? But then, impossibly, Max sat down. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Lily, but the aggression had melted into something else. Curiosity, confusion. No one knew Max's history. He'd been found wandering the outskirts of town, covered in scars, a broken chain still dangling from his collar. The vet said his teeth were worn down from chewing through metal. Someone had tried to turn him into a weapon, failed, and then discarded him like trash. Every human since had paid the price for that betrayal. Until now. Until this child who smelled like strawberry shampoo and didn't know the rules of fear. Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled dog treat, one she'd saved from her own lunch. "Here, puppy," she murmured, stretching out her hand. The shelter staff tensed. That hand was bite-sized, but Max didn't move. Then, slower than a sunset, he lowered his head and took the treat. Gently, like he was afraid his teeth might scratch her. A gasp rippled through the room. The manager's walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Code red in Kennel 5, the shepherd's loose." But no one reacted. The real shock wasn't that Max hadn't bitten. It was that he was now licking Lily's fingers, his tail thumping in a shaky rhythm, as if remembering a forgotten language. Kindness. But outside, tires screeched. A man's voice shouted, "Where is he? That's my dog." The shelter door burst open, and the figure standing there made Max's entire body lock up. His lips curled back into a snarl, but this time, it wasn't anger in his eyes. It was terror. The moment the stranger stepped into the shelter, the air turned electric. Max's entire body stiffened, his muscles coiled like springs ready to snap. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, deeper and more primal than anything the staff had heard before. This wasn't the same defensive aggression he'd shown earlier. This was pure, unshakable dread. The man in the doorway was tall, his leather jacket creaking as he moved, and the second his shadow fell across Max's kennel, the German shepherd backed into the farthest corner, his tail tucked between his legs. Lily, still standing close to Max, frowned. "Why's he scared now?" she asked, her small voice cutting through the tension. The stranger's eyes locked onto Max, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "There you are, boy," he said, his voice slick with false warmth. He took a step forward, and Max let out a sharp, panicked whine, a sound so unlike the fierce dog from moments ago that even the hardened shelter staff felt a chill. The manager stepped in front of the man, blocking his path. "Sir, you need to back up. This dog is mine," the man interrupted, pulling a wrinkled photo from his pocket. It showed a younger, healthier Max sitting beside him, but something about the image felt off. Max's posture in the photo was rigid, his ears pinned back, nothing like the relaxed dogs in the other adoption ads plastered on the shelter walls. The man didn't wait for permission. He reached for the kennel latch, and in that split second, Max did something no one expected. Instead of attacking, he bolted, straight toward Lily. Gasps filled the room as the massive dog closed the distance, but instead of teeth, they felt the brush of fur as Max pressed himself against the little girl, trembling. Lily, acting on pure instinct, wrapped her arms around his neck. "It's okay," she whispered into his fur. The man's face darkened. "That dog's dangerous," he snapped. "He needs to be put down before he hurts someone." But the shelter manager wasn't convinced. The way Max clung to Lily wasn't the behavior of a vicious animal. It was the act of a creature seeking protection. And the man's desperation to reclaim him? That reeked of something far worse than ownership. Just then, a sharp bark echoed from the back of the shelter. A smaller dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Benny, who'd been rescued from a hoarding situation, charged toward the confrontation, snarling at the stranger with unexpected ferocity. The man recoiled, kicking out at Benny, and that's when the pieces clicked. Max wasn't just afraid for himself. He was afraid for the other dogs, too. The shelter erupted into chaos as Benny the terrier launched himself at the stranger's leg, teeth sinking into the man's boot with a vicious snarl. The man let out a furious shout, shaking his leg violently to dislodge the small dog, but Benny held on like his life depended on it. Max, still pressed against Lily, let out a deep warning bark that shook the walls, a sound so powerful it made everyone freeze mid-motion. The manager quickly scooped Lily into his arms, while two staff members rushed forward to pull Benny away, but the little dog refused to release his grip until the stranger stumbled back against the doorframe. In that moment of confusion, Max did something extraordinary. Instead of cowering or attacking, he positioned himself between the stranger and everyone else in the room, his body rigid with protective fury, his eyes never leaving the man who claimed to be his owner. The stranger's face twisted in rage as he rubbed his injured leg. "That mutt's going to pay for that," he spat, pointing at Benny. But when he took another step forward, Max's lips curled back to reveal gleaming canines, a clear warning that this time he wouldn't hold back. The shelter staff exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't just a scared dog defending himself anymore. Max was standing guard, protecting the entire shelter from whatever threat this man represented. The manager, still holding Lily, noticed something strange. The little girl wasn't frightened at all. She was studying Max with quiet understanding, her small fingers gently patting the manager's shoulder as if to say everything would be all right. Then came the twist that changed everything. As the stranger reached into his jacket pocket, Max let out an ear-splitting howl and lunged forward, stopping just inches short of the man's outstretched hand. The man froze, his face going pale as a sheet. That's when everyone saw what he'd been reaching for. Not a weapon, but a worn leather leash with a heavy metal choke chain attached. The sight of that chain made Max's entire body tremble, his bravado crumbling into visible terror. Lily suddenly squirmed in the manager's arms. "Put me down," she demanded with unexpected urgency. When her feet touched the floor, she didn't hesitate. She ran straight to Max and threw her tiny arms around his neck again, pressing her cheek against his fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I won't let him hurt you anymore." The stranger's expression darkened. "You don't understand," he growled. "That dog's worth a fortune in the right hands. He's a champion fighter, or he was, before he turned coward." The words hung in the air like poison as the horrible truth became clear. Max hadn't just been abandoned. He'd escaped. The scars, the broken teeth, the instant terror at the sight of this man, it all made sense now. The shelter staff stood in stunned silence, realizing they weren't just witnessing a dog's fear, but the aftermath of unspeakable cruelty. Just when it seemed the tension couldn't escalate further, the shelter's back door burst open with a crash. A police officer strode in, hand resting on his holster. "We got a call about a disturbance," he announced, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. The stranger immediately backed away from Max, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Officer, thank God you're here," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "These people are trying to steal my property. That dog is a registered champion. Look, I have papers." He reached into his back pocket, but Max reacted violently, barking so fiercely that spittle flew from his jaws. The officer's hand tightened on his weapon as he studied the trembling German shepherd, then the terrified faces of the shelter staff, and finally the little girl who refused to leave Max's side. Lily looked up at the officer with tear-filled eyes. "Please," she said in a voice much too small for the weight of her words. "Max is a good dog. He just needs someone to love him." The officer hesitated, his gaze flicking between the aggressive stranger and the traumatized animal. Then, slowly, he reached not for his gun, but for his radio. "Dispatch, send animal control and a detective to the shelter," he said quietly. "I think we've got a case of animal abuse here." The stranger's face went slack with shock, then twisted in fury. He made one last desperate lunge toward Max, and that's when the unthinkable happened. The stranger's lunge toward Max triggered a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted. As his hand shot out to grab the dog's collar, Lily instinctively tightened her grip around Max's neck, burying her face in his fur. But instead of biting or retreating, Max did something extraordinary. He spun his massive body in a fluid motion, using his own bulk to shield Lily completely, while letting out a roar so deep it vibrated through the floor. The force of his movement knocked the stranger off balance, sending him stumbling backward into a stack of dog food bags that toppled with a thunderous crash. The shelter erupted into pandemonium, dogs barking hysterically in their kennels, staff members shouting, Benny the terrier darting between legs in a frenzy of protective fury. The police officer immediately stepped between the stranger and Max, his hand now firmly on his weapon. "That's enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Nobody moves." In the sudden stillness that followed, an unexpected sound broke the tension. Lily's quiet sobs as she clung to Max. The German shepherd, who moments before had been a whirlwind of protective fury, now stood perfectly still, letting the little girl bury her face in his fur while he gently nuzzled the top of her head with his muzzle. The officer's stern expression softened as he took in the scene. This wasn't a dangerous animal. This was a creature who had clearly chosen his family, regardless of paperwork or legal ownership. The stranger, panting on the floor amidst scattered kibble, saw his opportunity slipping away. His eyes darted wildly around the room before landing on the manager. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "That dog is worth more than your pathetic shelter makes in a year. He was bred to fight, trained to kill, and he belongs to me." The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. But before anyone could respond, Max suddenly stiffened. His ears pricked forward, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Then, without warning, he gently but firmly pushed Lily behind him and took 3 deliberate steps toward the stranger, his body language completely transformed. No longer fearful or aggressive, he moved with eerie purpose, his gaze locked onto the man's jacket pocket. The officer noticed first. What's he looking at? The stranger's hand flew to his pocket instinctively, but it was too late. Max let out a single, sharp bark that sounded almost like a command. Then came the twist that changed everything. From the stranger's pocket came a faint but unmistakable sound, the whimper of a puppy. The color drained from the man's face as Max barked again, this time with such desperate urgency that even Benny stopped growling to watch. The officer didn't hesitate. "Empty your pockets, now." When the stranger refused, the officer moved swiftly, grabbing the man's arm in a firm grip. What he pulled out sent a wave of horrified gasps through the room. A tiny, trembling German Shepherd puppy. No more than 6 weeks old, its fur matted and its ribs visible beneath its skin. The puppy's terrified eyes were identical to Max's. Lily let out a heartbroken cry and rushed forward, but Max was faster. With surprising gentleness, he took the puppy's scruff in his mouth and carried it to Lily, depositing it carefully in her outstretched arms before turning back to face the stranger with a look of pure, righteous fury. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about reclaiming a fighting dog. The man was breeding puppies for the same cruel purpose, and Max had somehow known. Known and tried to protect this tiny, innocent version of himself. The officer's radio crackled to life as backup arrived outside, but in that charged moment, only one thing mattered: the way the puppy immediately curled into Lily's chest, how Max stood guard over them both, and how the stranger's face twisted with the realization that he'd just lost everything. As the police moved in to arrest him, he spat one final threat. "This isn't over. That dog's bloodline is worth a fortune. You think a little girl can protect him?" But his words were drowned out by Lily's soft voice as she cradled the puppy, whispering promises that somehow, against all odds, Max seemed to understand. The shelter doors burst open as 2 more police officers rushed in, their boots pounding against the concrete floor as they took in the chaotic scene. The stranger thrashed violently against the first officer's grip, his face purple with rage as he screamed obscenities, but his words were cut short when Max let out a bone-chilling snarl that made even the officers freeze mid-step. The German Shepherd wasn't just protecting Lily and the puppy anymore. He was hurting the entire room, his body positioned strategically between the officers and the sobbing child, clutching the malnourished puppy to her chest. The lead officer slowly raised his hands in a calming gesture, his eyes darting between the traumatized dog and the furious suspect. "Easy, boy," he murmured, but Max's gaze remained locked on the stranger, his muscles coiled like springs ready to unleash devastation if the man so much as twitched wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. As the stranger was being handcuffed, his sleeve rode up, revealing a series of deep, jagged scars running along his forearm. Scars that perfectly matched the spacing of Max's teeth. The officer's eyes widened in realization. These weren't just random wounds. They were defensive bites, the kind made by a dog fighting for its life. The puppy in Lily's arms whimpered pitifully, snapping Max's attention back to the child. In an instant, his rigid posture softened. He nudged Lily gently with his nose, then carefully took the puppy's scruff again, carrying it over to a pile of donated blankets in the corner, where he began vigorously licking the tiny creature clean. The sight was so unexpectedly tender that several shelter staff members found themselves blinking back tears. Lily's father, who had been standing frozen in shock throughout the entire ordeal, finally found his voice. That man, he was using Max to breed fighting dogs? The officer nodded grimly. watching as Max continued tending to the puppy with almost maternal care. "Looks like it, and from those scars, I'd say Max put up one hell of a fight before he escaped." The implication settled over the room like a dark fog. Max hadn't just been a fighting dog. He'd been a champion, a prized stud for this underground operation, and his rebellion had been so fierce it left permanent marks on his abuser. Now, seeing him gently cleaning this puppy, likely his own offspring, while keeping one watchful eye on Lily, the true depth of his character became clear. This was no mindless killer. This was a soul who had endured hell and somehow retained the capacity for love. The arrested stranger was being led out when he suddenly wrenched free and spun back toward Max, his face contorted with manic desperation. "You think this is over, boy?" he spat. "I own you. Your bloodline, your papers, your damn DNA. The courts will give you back to me, and when they do—" His threat was cut short as Max, without breaking his careful cleaning of the puppy, lifted his head and locked eyes with his former tormentor. The growl that emanated from his chest wasn't loud, but it carried an unmistakable promise. "Try it. Just try taking me back." The raw authority in that sound made even the officers pause. The stranger paled, his bravado crumbling as he was, finally, forcefully escorted out. In the sudden quiet that followed, the shelter manager sank into a chair, running shaking hands through his hair. "We need to call animal control," he muttered. But Lily's sharp gasp made everyone turn. The puppy had staggered to its feet and was now wobbling toward Max on unsteady legs, its tiny tail wagging furiously. Max lowered his massive head, allowing the puppy to climb awkwardly over his muzzle and nestle between his front paws. The sight was so disarmingly sweet that the manager's professional resolve cracked. Or maybe not. Lily, sensing the shift in mood, scrambled to her feet and dashed to the office, returning with a battered collar and leash. "Look," she announced triumphantly. "It's blue, Max's favorite color." The adults exchanged amused glances. How would she know that? But their skepticism vanished when Max's tail thumped against the floor at the sight of the collar. Lily approached slowly, holding it out. "Can we keep them, Daddy? Please? Max saved the baby dog, and they need us." Her father opened his mouth to refuse, but the words died in his throat as Max gently nudged the puppy toward Lily with his nose, then lowered his head to accept the collar. The officer holstered his radio with a sigh. "I'll need to file paperwork about the puppy as evidence," he began. But one look at the trio, the scarred warrior dog, the trembling puppy, and the fearless little girl, made him reconsider. "But, given the circumstances, maybe we can work something out temporarily." Just as hope began to bloom, the shelter's phone rang shrilly. The manager answered, his expression growing increasingly grim. When he hung up, all eyes were on him. "That was the district attorney's office," he said quietly. "Turns out our friend has been running one of the largest dogfighting rings in the state. They're seizing all his assets, including any animals registered to him." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Max and the puppy were still legally the stranger's property. Lily, sensing the sudden tension, buried her face in Max's fur. "They can't take you away," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let them." Max licked her cheek once, then turned his gaze toward the door, his ears pricking forward. Outside, car doors slammed. The real battle was just beginning. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the shelter doors sent Max's head snapping up, his body instinctively positioning itself between Lily and whatever threat was coming. The puppy, sensing the tension, let out a tiny whimper and burrowed deeper into the folds of Lily's shirt. The shelter manager exchanged a nervous glance with the police officer still standing nearby, both men bracing themselves for another confrontation. But when the door swung open, it wasn't animal control officers or more police that entered. It was a tall woman in a sharply pressed suit, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, followed by two assistants carrying clipboards and cameras. The woman's sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Max, then flicking to the puppy in Lily's arms. "Well," she said in a voice that carried the weight of authority, "this must be the famous Max." Lily's father stepped forward, his protective instincts kicking in. "Who are you?" The woman reached into her jacket and produced a badge that made the shelter manager's face go pale. "Special Prosecutor Elena Vasquez, Organized Crime Division. That man you just arrested? He's been on our radar for years, but we've never had enough evidence to make charges stick until today." Her gaze returned to Max, studying him with a professional curiosity that slowly melted into something resembling admiration. "And it seems our key witness has 4 legs and a tail." The tension in the room eased slightly, but Max remained alert, his body still shielding Lily as the prosecutor approached. Then came the twist no one expected. Instead of reaching for the puppy or demanding paperwork, Vasquez crouched down several feet away from Max and did something extraordinary. She began speaking to him in quiet, measured tones, her hands visible at all times. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" she murmured. "But you got away. And today you helped us catch the man who hurt you." Max's ears twitched forward, his intense gaze locked on her face. Vasquez continued, her voice steady. "I need your help one more time. That puppy, are there others like him, others still in danger?" The room held its breath as Max seemed to consider her words. Then, with deliberate movement, he turned and nudged the puppy in Lily's arms before looking back at Vasquez and letting out a single, sharp bark. The prosecutor nodded as if she'd understood every word. "That's what I thought." Rising to her feet, she addressed the room. "Based on the condition of this puppy and the suspect's reaction, we have reason to believe there's a breeding operation still active. Normally, we'd take both dogs into custody as evidence." Lily let out a distressed noise, clutching the puppy tighter. "But," Vasquez continued, her expression softening slightly, "given the unique circumstances, I'm willing to consider an alternative." She turned to the shelter manager. "How secure are your facilities here?" The manager blinked in surprise. "We have reinforced kennels, 24-hour monitoring." Vasquez cut him off with a wave. "Not good enough. Not for dogs connected to an active criminal case." Her gaze shifted to Lily's father. "But a private home, with proper supervision?" The unspoken suggestion hung in the air. They could foster Max and the puppy temporarily. The relief on Lily's face was immediate, but her father hesitated. "We don't have any experience with dogs like Max," he admitted, glancing at the powerful German shepherd who was now watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Vasquez surprised them all by smiling. "I think Max has already made his choice clear." As if on cue, Max moved to Lily's side and sat down with military precision, his shoulder pressed against her leg in a show of quiet solidarity. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. "We'll need to microchip them both and take DNA samples, and there will be conditions. Regular check-ins, no unsupervised outings, and absolutely no contact with anyone claiming to represent the previous owner." Her expression turned grim. These men don't give up their investments easily. Just as it seemed things might work out, one of Vasquez's assistants, who had been examining Max's old kennel, called out sharply, "Ma'am, you need to see this." The assistant held up a small, muddy object, a dog tag that must have fallen off during the earlier struggle. The room went utterly silent as Vasquez read the inscription aloud. "Property of Blackthorn Kennels. Reward if found." The color drained from her face. "This changes everything," she whispered. "Blackthorn isn't just some backyard operation. It's one of the most notorious dogfighting syndicates on the East Coast." She looked at Max with new understanding. "If you came from Blackthorn, you're not just a fighting dog, you're their bloodline, which means they'll stop at nothing to get you back." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Lily, sensing the shift in mood, wrapped her arms around Max's neck. "Nobody's taking you away," she declared with childish certainty. But Vasquez's expression was grave as she pulled out her phone. "We need to move them now, tonight, somewhere off the books." Outside, a car engine roared to life. Too close, too sudden. Max's head snapped toward the window, a growl building in his chest. Vasquez's hand went to her sidearm. "That's not my team." The roar of the engine outside sent everyone into motion at once. Vasquez barking orders into her phone, the shelter staff rushing to secure the back exit. Lily's father, scooping up his daughter and the puppy in one swift motion. But Max didn't panic. His ears flattened against his skull as he positioned himself squarely between the door and his makeshift family, his entire body vibrating with a low, continuous growl that seemed to make the very air hum. The prosecutor's hand hovered near her weapon as she edged toward the window, peering through the blinds before recoiling sharply. "Two SUVs, blacked-out windows," she hissed. "No plates." The shelter manager lunged for the light switch, plunging the front room into darkness just as headlights swept across the building's exterior. In the sudden gloom, only Max's eyes gleamed. 2 points of amber fire fixed unblinkingly on the threat outside. Then came the sound they'd all been dreading. The crunch of boots on gravel, multiple pairs, moving with purpose around the perimeter. A fist pounded on the door hard enough to make the frame rattle. "Animal control," called a gruff voice that set Max's teeth on edge. "Open up," Vasquez mouthed bullshit to the room, before gesturing sharply toward the back. The real animal control would have announced themselves properly, with badges and paperwork. Whoever this was, they were after one thing only. Max seemed to understand this better than anyone. Without being commanded, he herded Lily and her father toward the shelter's storage room, his massive body moving with silent precision despite his size. The puppy in Lily's arms began to squirm and whine, but one soft lick from Max silenced it instantly, some unspoken canine communication passing between them. Vasquez waited until Max had his charges safely moving away before turning to the officer. "Back up," she whispered urgently. He shook his head, radio crackling with static. 10 minutes out, minimum. They exchanged a grim look. 10 minutes might as well be 10 hours against professionals. The pounding came again, harder this time. "Last warning," the voice outside snarled. Glass shattered as someone threw a brick through the front window, showering the floor with glittering shards. That was all the confirmation they needed. These weren't officials. These were Blackthorn's people, and they'd clearly been tracking Max this whole time. In the storage room, Lily's father frantically searched for an exit while Max stood guard at the door, his ears swiveling to track every sound. The puppy had begun shivering violently, its tiny body radiating fear. Lily, tears streaming down her face but voice steady, did something remarkable. She pressed her forehead against Max's and whispered, "You have to be brave now. We all do." The German shepherd huffed softly in response before suddenly stiffening, his nose twitching as he caught a scent the humans couldn't detect. His reaction was instantaneous. He grabbed the hem of Lily's shirt in his teeth and pulled her sharply backward, just as the storage room's exterior wall exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. A man, clad entirely in black, stood framed in the jagged hole, a crowbar in one hand and a catch-pole in the other. His eyes locked onto Max with predatory glee. "There you are, champion," he purred, taking a step forward. "Time to come home." Max didn't growl this time. The sound that ripped from his chest was something far more primal, the battle cry of a warrior who'd rather die than return to captivity. He launched himself at the intruder with terrifying speed, but the man was ready, swinging the catch-pole like a weapon. The metal loop connected with Max's shoulder with a sickening thud, sending the dog sprawling. Lily screamed and lunged forward, but her father held her back as the intruder advanced, raising the crowbar for another strike. Then the impossible happened. From the shadows behind the man, a small, scruffy blur shot forward. Benny, the terrier, moving faster than should have been possible for his size. With a snarl that would have done Max proud, he sank his teeth into the man's ankle and held on like a pit bull. The intruder howled in pain, stumbling backward as Benny shook his head violently, ripping through fabric and flesh alike. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Max regained his feet and charged again, this time going straight for the man's dominant arm. His jaws closed around the wrist, holding the crowbar with crushing force, the sound of snapping bone audible even over the man's scream. The catch-pole clattered to the ground as the intruder collapsed, clutching his ruined wrist. Chaos erupted as Vasquez and the officer burst into the room, weapons drawn. More figures were pouring through the shattered wall, but these wore vests emblazoned with "Police" in bold letters. Backup had arrived. The would-be dog thief was swiftly subdued, but as they dragged him away, he spat a final, chilling threat at Max. "They'll never stop coming for you. You're worth more dead than alive now." In the aftermath, as paramedics checked Lily for shock and officers secured the scene, Vasquez knelt beside Max, examining the welt rising on his shoulder. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" she murmured. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the hardened prosecutor stroked Max's head gently, before turning to Lily's father with a new intensity in her eyes. "We can't wait anymore. You're all coming with me, now. There's a safe house prepared." Lily, still clutching the puppy, looked up with wide eyes. "For how long?" Vasquez's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Until Max is no longer the most wanted dog in America." The safe house wasn't at all what Lily had imagined. No white picket fence or cozy fireplace like in storybooks. Instead, Vasquez drove them to a nondescript brick building on the outskirts of the city, its windows barred and its front door reinforced with steel plating. The prosecutor ushered them inside quickly, her eyes constantly scanning the street behind them. The interior smelled of stale coffee and gun oil, with flickering fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across stacks of file boxes and electronic equipment. A lone agent sat monitoring security feeds, barely glancing up as their ragtag group entered. A traumatized former fighting dog, a trembling puppy, a wide-eyed little girl, and her shell-shocked father. Max padded through the unfamiliar space with his nose working overtime, cataloging every scent, every potential threat. His shoulder still ached from the crowbar strike, but he refused to show weakness, not when Lily and the puppy depended on him. Vasquez led them to a sparse living area where 2 cots had been hastily set up. "You'll stay here until we dismantle Blackthorn's operation," she said, pulling a first aid kit from a cabinet. Lily immediately knelt beside Max, gently probing his injured shoulder while the puppy curled into a tight ball at their feet. "He needs a vet," Lily declared with surprising authority for a child. Vasquez shook her head. "Too risky, but I've got a contact coming, someone who treats police canines off the books." She studied Max with grudging respect. Though I'm not sure even our best dogs could have done what you did back there." Max huffed softly, licking Lily's hand as if to say he'd do it all again without hesitation. Night fell with an uneasy stillness. Lily and her father were given strict instructions. No phone calls, no going near windows, no contact with the outside world. The puppy, now christened Blue for his collar, slept fitfully in Lily's arms while Max maintained watch at the foot of her cot, his ears twitching at every distant siren or creak of the old building. It was during these quiet hours that the first strange occurrence happened. Max suddenly stood and trotted to the security camera in the corner, staring directly into the lens before letting out a soft woof. The agent monitoring the feeds frowned and adjusted his headset. "That's weird," he muttered. "The motion sensors on the east perimeter just tripped, but the cameras show nothing." Vasquez, who had been reviewing case files, looked up sharply. "False alarm?" The agent shook his head. "Third time tonight. Like something's out there, but not big enough to register properly." A chill ran down Lily's spine as Max returned to her side, his body tense. He knew something they didn't, something his keen senses had detected but human technology couldn't capture. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barred windows. Then came the sound that made Max's hackles rise, a faint, high-pitched whine from somewhere beyond the walls. Not a mechanical sound, not human, canine. Blue stirred in Lily's arms, his tiny nose quivering as if he too sensed it. Vasquez noticed their reaction and immediately reached for her sidearm. "Everyone stay put," she ordered, before moving to the security station. "Zoom in on Sector 4, she commanded. The agent manipulated the controls, the grainy black and white feed showing only empty pavement and swaying trees. Then, movement. A shadow flitting between parked cars, low to the ground. Fast. Max let out a noise none of them had heard before. A strange, yodeling howl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The response was immediate. An identical sound echoed from outside, followed by another and another. Vasquez's face went pale. "They're using dogs to case the safe house," she breathed. "Smart. Too smart." Lily's father pulled his daughter closer. What kind of people would... His question was cut short by a thunderous crash from the rear of the building. The security screens erupted into static as Max launched himself toward the sound, barking ferociously. Vasquez shouted into her radio, "Breach! Repeat, we have a..." The lights went out. In the pitch black, chaos erupted. Shouting, the scrape of furniture overturning, the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Lily felt Max's bulk press against her legs, his growl reverberating through her bones. Then, cutting through the darkness, a voice she recognized, the same man from the shelter, his words slurred with pain but dripping with malice. "Lights back on in 3, 2, 1. The emergency lights flickered to life, revealing a nightmare scene. Vasquez and 2 agents were pinned at gunpoint by masked intruders. The leader, the man with the broken wrist from earlier, stood grinning in the doorway, his injured arm in a sling. But what made Lily gasp wasn't the guns or the intruders. It was the 4 massive dogs flanking them, each wearing spiked collars and moving with military precision. They weren't growling. They weren't barking. They simply stared at Max with cold, calculating eyes, waiting for the command to attack. The man chuckled. "Meet Blackthorn's new generation, champion. Bred from your bloodline, but improved." He nodded toward Lily. "Give me the dog, or the girl learns why we call them crushers." Max didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, head high, ready to sacrifice himself, until Blue, the tiny puppy, suddenly wriggled free from Lily's grip and planted himself in front of Max, his baby teeth bared in a comically small snarl. The intruders laughed, until the security feed behind them crackled back to life, showing dozens of shadowy canine shapes converging on the building from all directions. Strays, shelter dogs, neighborhood pets, all answering a call only they could hear. The man's smile faltered. What the hell is this? From the darkness outside came a sound that would haunt his dreams. 100 dogs howling in unison. Max's army had arrived. The howling outside rose to an ear-splitting crescendo as the walls of the safe house seemed to vibrate with the force of it. The Blackthorn enforcer's smirk vanished, his good hand tightening on his weapon as his trained attack dogs, moments ago the picture of lethal discipline, began shifting uneasily, their ears flattening against their skulls. Max didn't move from his protective stance in front of Lily, but his posture changed subtly, head lifted, chest expanded, as if channeling some primal authority that made even the armed men hesitate. The puppy, Blue, let out a surprisingly deep growl for his size, his tiny body trembling not from fear, but from some inherited instinct telling him this was where he belonged, at Max's side, defending their family. Then the first window shattered. Not from gunfire or brute force, but from the sheer weight of a dozen scrappy street dogs hurling themselves against the reinforced glass in perfect synchronization. The Blackthorn enforcer shouted a command to his human team, but it was too late. The canine tide was already pouring in through every possible entry point. A wiry mutt with a chewed ear went straight for the gunman's injured wrist, sinking teeth into the bandages with surgical precision. A massive Rottweiler mix body-slammed one of the masked intruders into a wall, while a pack of smaller dogs targeted ankles and weapons with terrifying coordination. This wasn't random chaos. It was a calculated assault, guided by some unseen communication only the dogs understood. Vasquez, seizing the distraction, lunged for a fallen sidearm while Max did something extraordinary. He stepped forward and issued a single, sharp bark that cut through the pandemonium like a general's command. Every fighting dog in the room immediately disengaged and formed a bristling perimeter around the humans, their eyes locked on Max for further instructions. The Blackthorn enforcer, now backed into a corner with his 3 remaining men, stared at Max with dawning horror. "Impossible," he breathed. The alpha gene was just a theory. Lily, sensing the shift in power, suddenly broke free from her father's grip and ran to Max's side, her small hand burying in the fur at his neck. "You're not taking him," she declared, her voice shaking but clear, "and you're not taking Blue either." The Blackthorn enforcer's face twisted in rage as he raised his weapon, but before he could fire, a blur of tan fur shot from the chaos. Benny the terrier, covered in mud and panting wildly, launched himself at the man's face with a snarl that would have done a lion proud. The gun went off wildly, the bullet embedding in the ceiling as man and dog went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. In the resulting chaos, Vasquez and her team regained control, subduing the remaining intruders with practiced efficiency. But as the cuffs clicked into place, the Blackthorn enforcer fixed Max with a look of venomous promise. "This isn't over," he spat. "They'll burn cities to the ground to get you back, you and every pup carrying your blood." His gaze flicked meaningfully to Blue, then to Lily. "Especially the ones you care about." The words hung in the air like a death threat, but Max's response was immediate. He turned and gently took the cuff of Lily's jeans in his teeth, tugging her firmly back toward her father, while keeping his body between her and the prisoners. Vasquez, wiping blood from a split lip, surveyed the room. The defeated Blackthorn team, the panting dogs now sitting calmly at attention, the terrified but unharmed civilians, and made a decision. "We're relocating, now." She nodded to Max. All of us. As they hurriedly gathered their few belongings, Lily noticed something strange. The stray dogs were vanishing back into the night as silently as they'd arrived, but not before each one paused to touch noses with Max in what looked like a salute. The last to leave was a grizzled old shepherd mix with a pronounced limp, who hesitated at the broken window to lock eyes with Lily and give a single solemn wag of his tail before disappearing into the darkness. Vasquez's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Her face went pale as she read it. "We have a bigger problem," she said quietly. "Blackthorn didn't just send one team after Max tonight." She turned the screen to show security footage of shadowy figures scaling the fences at the shelter they'd just left. They're cleaning house, taking or killing every dog connected to Max's bloodline. Her eyes met Lily's, including the ones we left behind. Max's head snapped up, a soundless snarl twisting his muzzle. There were still dogs in danger. Dogs that had answered his call for help, and if the hardening look in his eyes was any indication, the champion of Blackthorn Kennels wasn't about to abandon them now. The tires of the armored SUV screeched against the pavement as Vasquez took a sharp turn, the safe house disappearing behind them in a blur of flashing red lights. Lily clutched Blue to her chest, the puppy's tiny heart pounding against her fingers as Max sat rigid beside her, his eyes locked on the passing streetlights. The tension in the vehicle was suffocating, Vasquez gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Lily's father muttering under his breath as he checked and rechecked the pistol Vasquez had pressed into his hands, the two remaining agents in the back seat scanning every shadow outside the tinted windows. But Max wasn't watching for threats. He was listening. His ears twitched at every distant siren, every bark, every rustle of leaves in the wind. He was mapping the city in his mind, tracing the scent trails back to the shelter, back to the dogs still trapped there. Vasquez's phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another encrypted message. Her jaw tightened. "They're already inside the shelter," she said, her voice clipped. "Cut the power, disabled the cameras." She glanced at Max in the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable. "They're not just taking the dogs, they're destroying evidence." Lily felt something hot and fierce rise in her chest. "We have to go back," she said, her voice small but steel-edged. Her father shook his head. "It's too dangerous." Max interrupted with a sudden, sharp whine, his nose pressing against the window. Outside, a streak of movement darted between the buildings. A dog, lean and fast, keeping pace with the SUV. Then another, and another. Vasquez's fingers tightened on the wheel. "They're following us," she murmured. But it wasn't an accusation. It was realization. The SUV lurched as she slammed on the brakes, pulling over in front of a derelict warehouse. "Change of plans," she said, turning to face them. "We can't outrun this, not when they're targeting every dog connected to Max." She hesitated, then looked at Lily. "You said we had to go back. Why?" Lily didn't hesitate. "Because Max won't leave them." A beat of silence. Then Vasquez nodded, her decision made. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a second pistol, checking the magazine with practiced ease. "Then we go back, but not as fugitives." She tapped out a rapid message on her phone. "We go back as a raid." The response was almost immediate. Headlights flicked on in the alleyways around them, engines rumbling to life. Unmarked cars, their windows rolled down just enough to reveal the glint of rifle barrels. Vasquez smirked. "Turns out the organized crime division has been waiting for a reason to hit Blackthorn for years." She glanced at Max. "And now we've got the key to the whole operation." Max's tail gave a single, resolute thump, but as they prepared to move, Blue suddenly squirmed in Lily's arms, letting out a high-pitched whimper. His tiny body was rigid, his nose pointed toward the shelter's direction, not in fear, but in urgency. Max stiffened, his ears snapping forward. Then, without warning, he threw his head back and howled. The sound was unlike anything Lily had ever heard, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very bones of the city. And from the darkness, the howls answered. Vasquez's phone lit up with one final message. Shelter cameras just came back online. You're not going to believe what's happening. The convoy of unmarked vehicles sped through the empty streets, their headlights cutting through the darkness like blades. Lily pressed her face against the cool glass of the SUV window, her breath fogging up the surface as she watched the shadows of dogs, dozens of them, keeping pace alongside the cars. Max stood braced between her and the door, his body tense with anticipation, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Blue, no longer trembling, sat upright in her lap, his tiny paws planted firmly as if he, too, were ready for whatever came next. When they skidded to a halt outside the shelter, the scene was nothing like what Lily expected. The gates hung open, twisted off their hinges. The parking lot was littered with overturned crates and scattered supplies. And the dogs were free, not cowering, not running, but standing together in a loose semicircle around the entrance, their heads lifted, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. At the center of it all was Benny, the scruffy terrier, his muzzle streaked with something dark, his chest puffed out with pride. When he spotted Max, his tail wagged furiously and he let out a triumphant yip. The Blackthorn operatives were nowhere to be seen. Vasquez and her team moved in first, weapons drawn, clearing the building with military precision. But what they found inside wasn't a massacre. It was a revolution. The kennels had been opened from the inside. Chewed-through locks dangled from doors. The security room was a wreck of shredded wires and shattered monitors. And in the back, where the fighting dogs had once been kept isolated, the heavy steel door stood ajar, its hinges bent outward, as if something massive had forced its way out. Max didn't wait for permission. He bolted inside, Lily and Blue close behind, Vasquez shouting after them. But when they reached the isolation wing, Lily froze. There, curled in the farthest corner, was a dog so scarred and battered she barely looked like a dog at all. One ear was missing. Her ribs stood out like ridges under patchy fur. But her eyes were clear and sharp, locked onto Max with an intensity that made the air hum. Max slowed, his approach cautious. Then, with a soft whine, he dipped his head. The scarred dog responded with a sound halfway between a growl and a sigh. And then, impossibly, she stood. Lily didn't understand. Not until Max turned to her, his gaze heavy with meaning. This wasn't just another victim of Blackthorn. This was his mother. Vasquez's radio crackled. "We've got the security footage," an agent's voice reported. "You need to see this." The video was grainy, but the story it told was unmistakable. The moment the power had been cut, the dogs hadn't panicked. They'd worked together. The smaller ones chewed through restraints. The bigger ones broke down doors. And when the Blackthorn team had stormed in, they hadn't been prepared for what met them. Not chaos, but strategy. The dogs had herded them, separated them, driven them into corners where they couldn't fight back. And then, one by one, they'd force them out. Not with teeth, not with violence, but with sheer, undeniable unity. As dawn broke over the shelter, Lily sat on the steps with Max on one side, Blue on the other, and Max's mother, now christened Grace by Vasquez, curled at their feet. The prosecutor joined them, her usual sharp edges softened by exhaustion and something like awe. "We'll take down Blackthorn for good this time," she said quietly. "Thanks to them." She nodded at the dogs. Lily stroked Max's head, her fingers threading through his fur. "They just needed someone to believe in them," she said. Max huffed, leaning into her touch. And in that moment the lesson was clear. Sometimes the bravest souls don't come on two legs. Sometimes loyalty isn't taught, it's earned. And sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't strength or fear, but the unbreakable bond between those who refuse to leave anyone behind.